Remember when we left off, John Thornton had just come into Buck's life and saved him from the company of Hal, Charles, and Mercedes. Those three had just met their untimely demise in the White River. John Thornton takes Buck in, tending to his wounds and showing him genuine care and affection. One thing we're not going to see in the Ocellus portion of this chapter is how Buck is willing to risk his own life before John Thornton's. One night in Dawson, John Thornton tries to stop a bar fight, but in the process is assaulted. Buck, being ever protective of his master, lunges at the man who assaulted John and starts going for his throat. This causes a stir in the town where the men gather to decide Buck's fate. After a bit of deliberation, they decide that Buck was acting in defense of his master, and his life should be spared. Buck once again saves John Thornton when John falls out of a boat into fierce rapids. Without hesitation, Buck jumps into the icy water to save his master. John grabs onto Buck's tail and later wraps his hands around Buck's neck as two men on shore pull them to safety. So we see that Buck is willing to lay his life on the line for Thornton, and as we get into Chapter 6, we'll see that his love for John Thornton can inspire him to do the impossible. So here we go, on to Chapter 6. The Call of the Wild, Chapter 6. This man had saved his life, which was something, but further, he was the ideal master. He had a way of taking Buck's head roughly between his hands and resting his own head upon Buck's, of shaking him back and forth, the while calling him ill names that to Buck were love names. Buck knew no greater joy than that rough embrace and the sound of murmured oaths, and at each jerk back and forth it seemed that his heart would be shaken out of his body, so great was its ecstasy. For a long time after his rescue, Buck did not like Thornton to get out of his sight. From the moment he left the tent to when he entered it again, Buck would follow at his heels. His transient masters, since he had come into the Northland, had bred in him a fear that no master could be permanent. He was afraid that Thornton would pass out of his life as Perrault and Francois. That winter, at Dawson, men waxed boastful of their favorite dogs. Buck, because of his record, was a target for these men, and Thornton was driven stoutly to defend him. At the end of half an hour, one man stated that his dog could start a sled with 500 pounds and walk off with it. A second bragged 600 for his dog, and a third, 700. said John Thornton. Buck could start 1,000 pounds.
And break it out, walk off with it for 100 yards?
Demanded Mathewson. And break it out and walk off with it for 100 yards, said John Thornton coolly.
Well,
Mathewson said, slowly and deliberately so that all could hear.
I've got $1,000 that says he can. And there it is.
So saying, he slammed a sack of gold dust of the size of a sausage down upon the bar. Thornton's doubt was strong in his face, but his fighting spirit was aroused. The fighting spirit that soars above odds, fails to recognize the impossible, and is deaf to all save the clamor of battle. The team of dogs was unhitched, and Buck, with his own harness, was put into the sled. He had caught the excitement, and he felt that in some way he must do a great thing for John Thornton. Gee! Thornton's voice rang out, sharp in the tense silence. Buck swung to the right, ending the movement in a plunge that took up the slack and with a sudden jerk arrested his 150 pounds. The load quivered, and from under the runners arose a crisp crackling. Ha! Thornton commanded. Buck duplicated the maneuver, this time to the left. The sled pivoted and the runner slipped a few inches to the side. The sled was broken out. Now mush! Thornton's command cracked out like a pistol shot. Buck threw himself forward. The sled lurched ahead and gained momentum till it was moving steadily along. Men gasped and began to breathe again. Thornton was running behind, encouraging Buck with cheery words. The distance had been measured off, and as he neared the pile of firewood which marked the end of the 100 yards, a cheer began to grow, which burst into a roar as he passed the firewood and halted at command. Every man was tearing himself loose, even Mathewson.
Yahoo!
Thornton fell on his knees beside Buck. Head was against head, and he was shaking him back and forth.